You told me about the Cox 049. Thousands of you in the comments, in the messages, in the emails that started with, I have not thought about this in 40 years, and ended with something that made you cry while you were typing it. You told me about the sound. You told me about the smell. You told me about your father. But there were stories you told me that I did not expect, and those are the ones I cannot stop thinking about. If you have not seen part 1, I will leave a link right here. Go watch that first, then come back. This one picks up where that one left off. A man named Phil wrote 3 sentences. He said he grew up in the 60s and 70s, and he hates to think of being a kid without Cox engines. He said it is a shame that today's youth has no hobbies like this. And then he wrote a line that hit me harder than anything else in 2,000 comments. He said, I think America has lost a lot of these blessings. Not toys, not products, blessings. A man in his 70s called a $2 engine a blessing, and he was not exaggerating. You never called it a .049. You called it an OH49. And if someone called it a .049, you knew they had never held one. You knew they had never flipped the prop with their finger on a cold morning and felt it catch and watched the propeller disappear into a blur that pulled the air toward you and filled your face with a mist that smelled like castor oil and Saturday. The name was an identity test. If you said 049, you were in. If you did not, you were not. 3 syllables separated the boys who had one from the boys who wished they did. There is something about the Cox 049 that no one talks about in the history books, and it is the thing that mattered most. When that engine started in your backyard, every kid in the neighborhood heard it, every single one. A man from the factory whistle comments described it perfectly. He said a teenager in his neighborhood would fly a P-40 at the local school, and 40 to 50 kids on bikes would show up and watch in amazement. That sound was all they had to hear, and they were pedaling towards it like they missed the ice cream truck. 40 to 50 kids on bikes, racing toward a sound, not because someone posted it on social media, not because someone sent a notification, because the scream of a Cox 049 carried 3 blocks in every direction, and every boy within earshot knew exactly what it was and dropped whatever he was doing and rode toward it as fast as his legs could push. That does not happen anymore. Nothing sounds like that anymore. Nothing pulls a neighborhood of boys off their porches and onto their bikes and toward one backyard where a kid they barely know is flying a plane they have never seen. The 0049 did not just make you a pilot, it made you a magnet. The moment that engine caught, you were the most important kid on the block. The prop hit your finger on a cold morning in November, and that is how you learned to cuss. The top comment on the biggest Cox video on YouTube with 1,300 likes was 7 words. That plastic prop backfiring and hitting your finger on a 40-degree morning, that is how I learned to cuss. 1,300 people pressed the like button because they had the exact same scar on the exact same knuckle from the exact same moment. The prop did not just teach you to fly, it taught you your first word that you could never say in front of your mother. It taught you that real things bite back, that engines do not care how old you are or how careful you are, and that the price of making something move under its own power is the willingness to bleed a little. There is a man in retirement now who sometimes forgets which day of the week it is, but he can still feel the prop hitting his finger 53 years later, and recollecting his first engineering repair brings tears to his eyes, though now they are tears of happiness and pride. The 049 made careers, not the way a guidance counselor makes a career with pamphlets and assessments, the way a burning match makes a fire. A mechanic with 40 years in the trade wrote that 60 years later, 40-some years solving engine issues, it all boils back to getting that damn Cox tuned to fly. 40 years of engines, 40 years of diagnostics and timing and fuel systems and compression ratios, and when he traces the whole thing back to the beginning, It does not lead to a classroom or a textbook. It leads to a 10-year-old on his knees in the driveway with a needle valve and a screwdriver, turning the valve an eighth of a turn and flipping the prop and listening and turning it again and flipping and listening again and learning by ear and by feel and by failure what a running engine is supposed to sound like. Another man wrote 5 words that say more than any diploma. Started with a Cox 049, now 40 years in the airline industry. The smallest engine in the world fed a career that lasted a lifetime. Leroy Cox understood this. He understood it so well that when a teacher wrote to the factory asking for educational materials about the engines, Cox wrote back and said, "We do not have any instructional materials, but we are sending you a half-dozen engines." He did not send a pamphlet, he sent engines. Because Leroy Cox knew that the only way to learn what an 049 could teach you was to hold one in your hand and flip the prop and burn your finger and figure it out. He sent free engines to a school because he believed that a boy holding a real machine would learn more in one afternoon than a boy reading about a machine would learn in a year. He was right. He was right about everything. The man started with wooden pop guns in his garage and built the largest toy engine empire in the world. And when the factory burned down with no insurance, he rebuilt it in 4 days. And when the competition tried to match his $3.95 Babe B, they went bankrupt trying. And when Disneyland asked him to run the flight circle in Tomorrowland, he said yes and sold more product per square foot from that hobby shop than any store in America. Kids in the neighborhood around the Santa Ana factory used to walk right through the front door when their Cox cars would not start. They did not call ahead. They did not make an appointment. They walked in off the street, and someone in the back shop would kneel down and show them how to adjust the needle valve and what fuel mix to use and how to prime the engine properly. And they would send those kids home with their cars running and their faces covered in castor oil mist. That was the culture Leroy Cox built, a factory where the door was open and the answer to a 10-year-old's question was always yes. Come in, let me show you. And here is something you probably did not know. Leroy Cox was a pilot himself, not a model airplane pilot, a real one. He flew a 1950 Navion for business trips up and down the West Coast and a 1927 Fleet biplane on weekends for fun. The man who put flight into the hands of 10 million boys could fly himself. He built the dream because he had lived it. The 049 crossed oceans. A man in England wrote that his father was in the Royal Navy, and when his ship put into America, his father brought home 2 Cox Stukas models with the bomb drop feature, one for him and one for his brother. Sitting there now, more than 50 years later, he said what he would not give to go back to those happy times. His father carried those boxes across the Atlantic Ocean on a warship because he knew his sons would love them. Behind the Iron Curtain, a boy in Eastern Europe wrote that the Cox was beyond his reach in the 1970s. Beyond his reach. Behind a wall that separated half the world from the other half. And then he wrote the sentence that stopped me. The only Cox plane I ever had, I cannot possibly think how my father managed to get me one. He does not know how. He never found out. His father found a way to get a toy engine through a political barrier that stopped governments, and the boy never asked how because the answer did not matter. What mattered was that his father had done something impossible for him, and the proof was a purple Supersport trainer that he learned to fly in a country where a Cox engine was worth more than a month's wages. Someone on a forum posted a photograph of 3 engines. The first was his, a 1996 Cox Killer B. The second was his father's, a 1964 McCoy. The third was his grandfather's, a 1946 Thor. 3 engines, 3 generations, grandfather to father to son, each one passing down not just a machine, but a way of understanding the world, a way of using your hands, a way of standing in a yard and making something fly and feeling the same thing your father felt and his father felt before him. That photograph is a family tree built from aluminum and steel and castor oil. Not every story ended with the engine on a shelf. A 79-year-old man wrote that he remembered the 049s he put into planes he built from kits and later from scratch. He was building his best work yet when the Vietnam War ended his grand plans. 6 words: the Vietnam War ended my grand plans. He was drafted. The plane stayed on the workbench. The engines went into a box. And when he came home, the world had moved on, and the boy who built planes from scratch was a man who had seen things that made model airplanes feel like they belonged to someone else's life. The memories of the planes are fond, he wrote, fond. Not joyful, not exciting, fond. The word you use for something you loved that was taken from you before you were finished with it. Then the world decided that the 049 was too dangerous for children. In 2008, Congress passed the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act. Lead in the metal, flammable fuel, a hot exhaust pipe, a spinning propeller with no guard, everything that made the 049 real, everything that made it bite and burn and teach was now a violation. The engine that had been sold to 10-year-old boys for 50 years was reclassified as a hazard. You could not sell it to a child anymore. The thing that had taught patience and precision and mechanical instinct to an entire generation was legislated out of childhood because childhood had been redefined as a place where nothing should be hot, nothing should be sharp, and nothing should require a 10-year-old to learn the difference between a quarter turn and an eighth of a turn on a needle valve while kneeling on concrete with castor oil on his hands. The company that carried Leroy Cox's name did not survive to argue the point. Estes had already hollowed it out. They mixed parts from different engines, making hybrids that performed poorly. They added electric radio control models under the Cox name, and some of those models exploded. The brand that Leroy Cox had built on tolerances of 25 millionths of an inch, on engines that started on the first flip, on quality that no competitor could match, now had products with his name on them that blew up in children's hands. There was a product recall, there was silence. And in February of 2009, the last Cox engine rolled off the line. A man tried to give the 049 to his son. He bought the engine, he set up the workbench, he mixed the fuel, he showed the boy how to flip the prop, just the way his own father had shown him 30 years earlier. And the boy looked at him the way you would look at someone offering you a rotary telephone. He could not be bothered. That is what the man wrote. 3 words followed by a period and the word sad. My son could not be bothered. Sad. The sentence has 102 likes because 102 men had the same experience. They tried to pass it down. The son did not want it. Not because the engine was broken, because the world was different, because patience had been replaced by instant results, and mechanical instinct had been replaced by software, and the willingness to kneel on concrete with oil on your hands and fail 9 times before succeeding on the 10th had been replaced by a screen that never fails and never bites and never smells like anything at all. But here is what I want to leave you with, because this is the part that matters more than the legislation and the corporate failures and the sons who could not be bothered. There is a photograph somewhere on the internet of 6 men between the ages of 60 and 80 huddled on a runway at a model airplane club, all of them crouched around a single Cox 049, trying to get it running long enough to fly it one more time. 6 men. White hair, bad knees, bifocals, and every single one of them was 10 years old again for the 3 minutes that engine ran. Someone in the comments wrote that the 049 generation was the last intuitive engineer generation. He did not mean it as nostalgia, he meant it as a fact. The boys who grew up flipping a Cox propeller with their bare fingers learned something that cannot be taught on a screen. They learned to tune by ear. They learn to diagnose by feel. They learn that a machine has a personality and a mood and a preference, and that the difference between an engine that runs and an engine that quits is not a setting in a menu. It is a quarter turn of a needle valve that you can only find by listening. That generation is in its 60s and 70s now. They are the mechanics and the engineers and the pilots and the machinists who kept the country running for 40 years, and every single one of them can trace the beginning of what they know back to a backyard and a battery and a can of fuel and a father standing 3 feet behind them with his arms crossed and a look on his face that said, "Go ahead, flip it, I am right here." The engine is still in your attic. You told me that in part 1, and you told me again in the comments, and you will tell me again right now because it is true. It is in a box on a shelf behind the Christmas lights, and the propeller is still on it, and the fuel line is cracked, and the crankshaft still turns freely when you flip it with your finger. You know it would start if you cleaned it up. You know it would run. A Cox 049 does not stop being a Cox 049 because 40 years have passed. It does not stop being what Leroy Cox built it to be. It waits. It waits on the shelf in the dark in a box that smells like old castor oil, and it waits for the day you take it down and flip the prop one more time and hear the sound that pulled 50 kids on bikes toward your backyard and taught you your first cuss word and started a career you did not see coming and connected you to your father and your grandfather and every boy who ever knelt on concrete with fuel on his hands and believed that the most important thing in the world was the next 3 seconds. You called it an 049. You never called it anything else. And if your hands are shaking right now, it is because they remember. What did the 049 turn you into? A mechanic, a pilot, an engineer? Tell me in the comments, and tell me if that engine is still in the attic.